Hello and welcome to our final conference keynote session with Chef Sean Brock and Sam Jett, Heirloom Cooking, Reverence, Curiosity, and Discovery. I'm Jeanine Scheffert, and I will be your host for this session. Thank you to Humanities Iowa and Jonga for supporting this session and for helping to make this entire conference possible. Before I introduce our final keynotes, let's take a look at the community agreements one more time. As a conference community, we agree to be respectful, curious, and patient, to speak from our own experiences, avoiding jargon, to be conscious of intent versus impact, to take space, make space, and to take care of yourself. We're here today with Chef Sean Brock and Sam Jett. Raised in rural Virginia, Sean Brock is a distinguished chef and restaurateur known for his involvement in the repatriation of Southern pantry and cuisine over the last 20 years. For over a decade, he was the chef and partner of McCrady's and McCrady's Tavern in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as the founding chef of Husk Restaurants, located in Charleston, Nashville, and in Savannah. In 2019, he laid down roots in Nashville to open 4 ambitious and unique restaurant endeavors: Joyland, the Continental, Audrey, and the forthcoming June. Brock won the James Beard Award for Best Chef Southeast in 2010 and is a 4-time finalist for Outstanding Chef, as well as a 3-time finalist for Rising Star Chef. His first cookbook, Heritage, is a New York Times bestseller and winner of the 2015 American Cooking James Beard Award. Brock's second book, South, was also a New York Times bestseller and was nominated for a James Beard Award. Brock hosted season 2 of the Emmy Award-winning television show Mind of a Chef, produced by Anthony Bourdain. In 2019, Sean was featured on the popular Netflix show Chef's Table. As a Tennessee native, Sam Jett is the Director of Operations at Audrey. Stemming back to his early childhood memories with his mother and grandmother, Jett has had an affinity for food and cooking for as long as he can remember. While attending community college, Jett worked various restaurant manager and line cook positions before realizing that if he could spend and enjoy that much time in the kitchen, he ought to look at a career in this space. It was then that his brother bought him a copy of the book, The Making of a Chef, and the rest was history. In 2004, Jett enrolled in the Culinary Arts program at Johnson & Wales in Charlotte. Following graduation, he began his culinary endeavors working and learning about restaurants. He began working with Chef Sean Brock in 2013 for the opening of Husk Nashville. In 2015, Jett took on the role of chef de cuisine to open restaurateur Ashley Christensen's Death and Taxes in Raleigh, North Carolina, before heading back to work with Brock, where he has been for the last 8 years. Today, Chef Sean and Sam will be doing a live cooking demo for us and telling us all about the work they do in their lab. We'll learn why seed saving is important to them as Southerners, how they approach ingredients utilizing their creative process, and what the true possibilities are for these ingredients in their lab. Chef Sean and Sam, thank you so much for being here. We're so very much looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are so excited to be here, and thank you to Seed Savers Exchange for inviting us into your world. I thought it would be a lot of fun to share our perspective and how seed saving affects our day-to-day lives, running a restaurant focused on an obsession with Southern ingredients. Standing in our research and development lab, not something you would normally see in a kitchen, and not something that you normally associate with Southern cooking. To me, that's the whole point. I grew up in central Appalachia, right where Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee all kind of come together. And that part of the world has a very, very unique cuisine. And that cuisine is very fascinating to me because it is a combination of German and Cherokee plants, traditions, and influences. And that's the food that I grew up with. And I lived in such a rural place. I just thought that everyone ate all of these things that we ate that I later found out were kind of bizarre. Things like sour corn. And this to me is a fascinating example of how one flavor, one tradition can exist in a tiny little micro-regional pocket of the world. And it helped me realize very, very early on, as a teenager, in fact, how lucky I was to have grown up with that storybook Appalachian grandmother who had a basement full of preserves, and every square inch of her property had food growing on it. I actually lived with my grandmother for a few years, and during those years, I think I was 11, 12, 13, 14. That's when I lived with my grandmother. And a lot of my chores were in the garden. And for as long as I could remember, I was always running around in a garden, picking things and eating them while they're still fresh, alive, and vibrant. To this day, I was thinking about it this morning, I can still remember, I can see, I can smell, I can hear the scene of my grandmother saying, I want to show you something neat. And her walking into the field and seeing, I think she maybe even had a dress on, but just seeing this woman standing in a field, she reached over and grabbed this green plant and started tugging on it. And when she pulled it out, there were potatoes everywhere. I had no idea that potatoes grew underground, and my mind was blown. She cleaned it off and handed it to me to taste, even still with some dirt on it. And I still remember that moment as one of those moments where I understood the importance of clean, fresh, healthy, wonderful food, as fresh as possible. Later in my life, after being supported by my grandmother to become a chef, I started in restaurants when I was 15. And you got to keep in mind, I'd spent the last 4 years with my grandmother eating her cooking for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Her name was Audrey, by the way. That's where we are. We're in the Audrey lab. This restaurant has been an amazing journey for me because I get to take these things that my grandmother taught me, and now that my mother continues to teach me, and I get to ask the question, how can we make it better? How can we continue to push it forward? Because in my mind, that is the ultimate amount of respect that you can give ingredients and your craft. When I first took that job, when I was 15, I was in charge of making the salads. And I remember them handing me a box, opening it up, tearing the plastic open, and there was just this sad, sad lettuce. And I remember how confused I was because I'd never even seen sad lettuce before. I'd only ever eaten it directly from the ground. And I went back and talked to my grandmother about it. And I was already having those conversations at the age of 15. And she saw that and started teaching me about her varietals and a little bit about saving seeds. And I went to culinary school and fell in love with it. I went to culinary school in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was my first time really getting outside of Appalachia. It was most definitely my first time witnessing a completely different cuisine. And I remember the first time I started telling people at that job about the things that I grew up with eating. And I remember their responses, they just had never heard of anything. And so from my perspective, I thought everybody ate all this stuff. So I started bringing in all this show and tell. Every time I would go to Appalachia to see my grandmother, I would load up my truck with as much stuff as I could, and we would have these show and tell experiences at the restaurant. I remember the first thing I brought was sour corn, and laughing at everyone spitting it out, because when your brain sees corn, it thinks sweet. And if you eat something sour that's supposed to be sweet, your brain thinks it's bad. And I remember going back and telling my grandmother that, and her really, really getting a kick out of it. The interesting thing about going from Appalachia to Charleston was the complete difference in ingredients, the overall pantry. And I'd never seen anything like that before. I'd never seen these things. I didn't know anything about rice. And rice is the most important crop of that area. And I fell in love with low country cooking. And I loved spending time in the low country and going to school and working in really nice restaurants as well. And I hopped around a little bit at some different restaurants. I went to Richmond, Virginia for a little while and worked, and that was in the early 2000s. And I recall really for one of the first times working in a place that obsessed over the varietal of corn, how it was milled, where it was milled, when it was milled, and that really started to make sense for me as a chef. And I ended up in Nashville working for a few years and then back in Charleston. When I got back to Charleston in 2006, I had been missing those flavors, and I'd been missing those stories, and I'd been missing those dishes. I took a job at a beautiful restaurant that was built in 1778. And when you go to work every day in a building that old, it was hard for me to not always think about what the flavors were, how were they different from what we were cooking. And this was 17 years ago, and I had started to become very, very interested in agriculture in general. And I realized that if I needed these specific varietals because the flavor was unmatched, the stories were what we needed to tell to gain the attention to the cuisine that we feel like it deserved, I decided that I would just try and do it myself. And I learned very quickly that chefs probably shouldn't be farmers, and that lasted a few years, maybe 5 years, 6 years. But I fell in love with the soil again. I fell in love with the dirt. I fell in love with, obsessing over watching a plant grow and making sure that it's safe and healthy, and then reaping that reward when I got to eat it straight from the plant, just like I did at my grandmother's house. As I started to realize that a big part of being a great chef in the South had to do with your ability to collect important ingredients that were and are, in some cases, still at risk of extinction. And for us as a chef, when an ingredient dies, for us that would be, it's not available for us to use in the restaurant and cook and eat and preserve and celebrate, those stories also fall to the wayside. And in 2007, something big happened to me. I was at a talk at Blackberry Farm. It was January. It was the winter of 2007. And I was sitting in on a talk between Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills and John Coykendall of Blackberry Farm. And they were doing a talk and a demo about a varietal of corn that John had grown up with and couldn't ever find anywhere else. And it convinced himself that that flavor of his childhood he'd never be able to experience again. He made the mistake of telling that story to Glenn Roberts, who is like the Indiana Jones of seed saving, and Glenn found it. And we sat there that day eating a bowl of grits from that corn experiencing what John experienced as a child. And that something, it lit a fire in me. It was the spark that I needed. It ignited this new passion. I felt a connection to cuisine like I'd never felt it before. I'd always felt connected to food. I'd never felt that connected to a cuisine. And cuisines are a critical part of culture. And cuisines come together in different ways. If you look at the American South, where I've lived and cooked my whole life, you'll quickly notice, like, if you were to break it off of the United States, you could hold it beside Europe and realize how vast the American South truly is. And within that little pocket of the United States, I believe strongly that there are hundreds of cuisines, hundreds of micro cuisines, because I define cuisine as the way food ends up on the plate. How did it even get there? How did it get to this place in this world? And why does it taste this way? Well, the answer is from the people who were here before us and their cultural influences and their agricultural practices and their ingredients. And so if we go back to what I touched on earlier about the cuisine that I grew up in, Appalachia, you'll see the importance of corn, beans, squash, and those stories that go along with them are oftentimes stories of wisdom or a place or a family or a period of time. And these serve as constant reminders of truly hard-fought wisdom. Those seeds carry that wisdom. Speaking in front of seed savers for the first time I'm just realizing it's really fun for me, because I'm constantly having to explain why seed saving is important. And I'm glad I don't have to explain that to everyone here. I can just talk about how we get to use it and how we get to come to work every day and try and explore new ways of unlocking these little these doors within each ingredient that have these hidden flavors that quite maybe haven't been discovered yet. And that always starts with the varietal for us. And when I heard that talk back in 2007, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the reward and how it must feel to take something that's nearly gone, plant it, nourish it, and then share it. I knew I had to be a seed saver. And so that evening, I do recall a massive table full of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. And at this point, it was a bit later in the evening, and I was a bit shy to say to John and Glenn, two people who I hold in high regard, the highest regard, that I wanted to be a seed saver. And thanks to the whiskey, I was able to say that, and they were kind enough to explain that it's not as easy as it seems. But I was adamant, and within a few days, Glenn had contacted me and said, I got it. I got the seed that needs to be your first seed saving project. It spent half its time in Appalachia and half its time in the low country, just like you. And it's an old red varietal of corn that was very, very popular among the moonshiners and the whiskey makers. And this corn varietal, called Jimmy Red, was being saved by a gentleman named Ted Jeanine. And I remember the email clearly. It said, Ted won't just send you seeds. You need to come meet him and spend the day with his family. I thought that was amazing. I'd never been so nervous. I felt like I had to pass a test to be able to prove that I was worthy of taking these rare seeds that he'd spent so many years taking care of. And I remember that day so vividly. And I walked away with a few ears of corn, planted them that March, and I was able to live out that dream of experiencing what it would be like. And I'll never forget the first time to make grits and to make cornbread, you need a mill. I was a restaurant and a chef with no mill. So we took the corn, realized we didn't have anything to help us get the corn off the cob. So we were sitting there with a kitchen spoon, popping the ears of corn off one at a time. And instead of a mill, I thought, well, what is a mill? What does it even do anyway? I just need this corn smaller so I can make some cornbread, so I can taste this stuff. And I remember Glenn always talking about the importance of temperature in milling. This was right around the same time I was not only obsessed with agriculture, I was also obsessed with modern cooking. And I happened to have a tank of liquid nitrogen. And we poured liquid nitrogen on the corn and threw it into a blender, which I do not recommend at all. But it milled the corn that day, and I made cornbread. And that cornbread coming out, cracking it open, smelling it, eating it, I haven't looked back since. Seed saving has become a big part of my identity as a person. And it's not just seed saving for me. It's vinyl records, it's old guitars, it's this idea that these things are so special that we must protect them at all costs. They can teach us so much more than something that is boring and not delicious. There's a reason that these heirloom varietals are more delicious and they're more nutritious. So they taste better, they're better for you, and they teach us a lesson. And that's good enough for me. Here, where we're standing, in Audrey, in this lab, is something that I've dreamt of for a long, long time. The ability to have a place full of more scientific equipment to allow us to explore ingredients in new ways. So we'll talk a lot about that today. There's a reason why all of this is important to me. And I am at a point in my life and in my career where I'm starting to think about what I'm leaving behind. And my dream, my goal as a chef, as a person, as a Southerner, is to find a unique tradition that will last much longer than me and will inspire many more generations to come. Today, we chose to focus on a varietal of green bean that I grew up with and have always had trouble finding. These would not grow in Charleston. So I spent many, many years not being able to smell and taste these beans of my childhood. And these greasy beans are a wild variety. First appearance, they seem like toys, like plastic food. They're so shiny and glossy. And these are from Appalachia. And now that I live in a region in Nashville where these grow, it has become a huge source of discovery and curiosity and reverence for us. This bean is mighty, and it is extraordinarily delicious. I don't think there's any bean like it in the whole world, and it's ours. And I think the communal aspect, the communal pride aspect of this kind of cooking and seed saving is very, very important. I remember as a child how competitive my grandparents were about who grew the best beans. And, chefs are like that with their cuisine for sure. And farmers are like that with their ingredients. And I think communities, if you start thinking about it, food has the ability to inspire us all. This bean inspires me a great deal. The classic preparation, let's start with how my grandmother would prepare these. We would string them and break them, and she would put them in a salt solution and then pressure can them. And then when it came time to eat them, she would pour that pot with the brine in it directly into a pan and a little bit of fat of some sort. Early days lard, later days corn oil probably. But you cook that down until there's nothing left, and then you create this beautiful glaze and this concentration of flavor. That's one way that my family would cook them. Another way that I find fascinating is pickled. Not pickled as in dilly beans or vinegar pickled, but actually just like sauerkraut. So this is salt, water, and beans. And this is something that you don't see in many other cultures and many other places. This sauerkraut of green beans. And to me, that's a source of communal pride. I love forcing these upon people when they're having dinner. We eat them. A lot of cultures have kimchis and sauerkrauts and these sour or spicy things that break up what can be a meal that you may have to eat once a week. Not boring. So they have many, many uses. This one is one that most people have never seen or heard of or experienced. This is called shucky beans or leather breeches. And it's this same bean, strung, and then a needle and thread goes through it, and it hangs above the fireplace. That preserves the beans and also concentrates the flavor and adds a bit of smoky aroma so that now these can be preserved for years. Cooking them traditionally, you would put them in a pressure cooker, the same way as the salt brine canned pressure cooked greasy beans. These would go into a pressure cooker with a little bit of fat and some water, and they just turn into, they melt almost into this roast beef texture and flavor and overall experience. And so those are some ways that the people of Appalachia, where I grew up, have utilized this bean. And so my role, I believe, in all of this is to hold this bean and say, what else do you have in you? What else can we squeeze out of you? We want to be able to find ways to concentrate this flavor, to extract this flavor, so that we can then use it as a seasoning for itself, which to me is the ultimate respect for something. Is wrapping a flavor around itself over and over again, concentrating the flavor, creating layers and layers from the same ingredient. Why is that important? Why the effort? Because if you come to Audrey and you sit down and you eat a plate of these beans prepared by us, seasoned with all of these things that we're able to use, the goal and the hope is that it's so delicious, you become curious. How can I get that at my house? Why don't other restaurants have those beans? I've never had a bean like this. And for us, that's important because we're on somewhat of a mission to prove to the world that Southern food is the greatest food on the entire planet and has the most possibilities. When you take a humble ingredient like a green bean and bring it into a lab, what happens? Our goal is to find ways to squeeze sweet, sour, salty, bitter, spicy, acidic, kokubi, umami versions of all these different things. And that's where Sam comes in. Sam and I have been working together for a long time, and I have a lot of crazy ideas, very, very, very curious, and Sam and Elliot here in the lab, they bring all those things to life. Before we get into a little bit more about beans, I wanted to show another very interesting discovery here in the lab with heirloom ingredients that I think is going to really, it's changed so much for my cooking. And I think I think people are going to really catch on to this kind of ingredient. And so what we did, so this is Mr. Stripy tomato. That tomato was my grandmother's favorite. That's the one that she seed saved and was obsessed with. And that's the tomato that is on all of the roadside stands where I grew up. It's a yellow and red streaked tomato, almost tie-dye looking tomato that has very little seed and is almost 80%, 90% meat. It's elegant. It's acidic. It has umami. We were able to concentrate it down into this very, very flavorful syrup that is a one-stop shop. It has salt, it has sour, it has acid, and it has sweetness. And this is a very easy process. We make a sauerkraut of tomato first, and then we press it and carefully, slowly reduce it down to this syrup, this molasses that becomes really, really concentrated in flavor. And currently downstairs on the menu in the restaurant, we debuted yesterday this dish, a dish that we've been waiting a year to use this syrup that we worked on when tomatoes weren't in season, so that we can put the tomato on the plate, drizzle this over it, and hopefully blow someone's mind. That's the kind of cooking that we're interested in. We're interested in the storytelling aspect of it. We're interested in the discovery aspect of it. And for me, it's never ending. I plan on standing here 20 years from now talking about a new discovery from this Greasy bean. And to me, that's a privilege, that's an honor. And we're going to cook a dish with these beans and show how we season everything with itself. But first, Sam's going to take some time and walk through each of the ingredients, or each of the ingredients and how we make it. Start. I think this is a great start
to show you. Yeah. So when we talked about, Chef talked about how we like to season things with ourselves. One thing that I'm kind of obsessed with is capturing an ingredient at each stage in the cooking process. So if you take a pot of beans, you cook it like a Southerner, you cook it down until there's nothing left. Cook it until it's glazed, and the only thing that's in that pan is green beans, maybe some salt and pepper. And when you do that, you get this super rich umami, very concentrated flavor, really deep, especially with greasy beans. What I and Elliot try to do is find where I can stop that process. So here, this is a shoyu, or a soy sauce, but instead of using soybeans, we are using greasy beans.
And that's what I'm talking about when I say I truly believe there are undiscovered traditions within these southern ingredients within our pantry. So this is where we start. We say, okay, who's already done the legwork? If people in Japan can make this jam-packed, concentrated flavor out of soybeans, then we can do it out of greasy beans. Then we take that a step further. And actually, this is a soy sauce made from
leather bridges.
And
this is still in the works. This will be a year or 2 years old before we even get to it. You know, and maybe we don't want something as rich, or we want something that brings just the more vegetal, lightly cooked flavor. So instead of doing a full shoyu, we'll do something called liquid shiokoji or shiokoji. And all that means is salt, and this koji is a fermented rice. We mix those together with the beans, and the rice, the mold on the rice makes these enzymes that digest the bean's protein. And so it unleashes all the umami, it unleashes all these different volatile chemicals that are within the fibers of the bean, and brings it to a forefront or into a form that's liquid, so it's easily perceived on your palate. So this liquid shiokoji is somewhere between, it's like a blanched green bean. It's not near as strong or deep and rich as a shoyu or as a cooked down leather bridges, but it's right there. And then we have, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, when we talk about what flavors are kept in a bean, this is an oil. We use this machine here, the roto evaporator, and we're able to distill the fresh essence of the bean and get all of the aromas, just like if you're right in the field, you're picking it off, you're cracking it, you smell it, you taste it. We're able to pull all of that without the starch, the raw bean starch. So,
and what the result ends up being is like a grassy olive oil.
Yeah.
Who knows? That could be our thing. This to me is a perfect example of something that I've never seen before, something that I've never tasted before, but makes perfect sense. The way we make this is pretty fascinating, and it stems back to that potato story. So when I was in that field eating that potato, it was fireworks. It was electricity. It was electric. It was alive. And having spent my childhood eating food seconds old, minutes old, that was how my brain got wired. And so that's what my standard, my bar for greatness was. And so I found myself over the years chasing that vibrancy, that flavor of the field. And time is an enemy of that. Heat is an enemy of that. Bruising is an enemy of that. And we use this really, really neat, complex technique to get this flavor that I think is fascinating, because this fat, this oil, tastes like eating a green bean right off the plant. And I'll tell you how we do that. We take these beans, and we have to have a real understanding of how extraction of flavor and aroma works. And once you start learning about that world, you immediately stumble upon vanilla extract. Vanilla extract uses alcohol because the chemical makeup of the alcohol has the ability to pull, I think, somewhere close to 50% more flavor and aroma from the product. So we take these beans, and this is how obsessive we get with not disturbing the fresh qualities. Instead of chopping this up or putting it in a blender, which I believe will bruise it and cause oxidation, which changes the flavor and aroma, we smash this with liquid nitrogen. That helps us stay away from heat and bruising, but it allows us to increase the surface area for a higher extraction. So then the bean goes into its solvent, in this case alcohol, just like vanilla extract. That sits overnight, and it even pulls out color, it even pulls out pigment. It's fascinating. So the very next day, to get that from a solvent-based product to fat-based product, we pour the neutral oil directly into the alcohol, And then we go over to this distillation device that also has the ability to utilize vacuum. And we push the vacuum to hold in all of the flavor, aroma, and pigment, and only let the alcohol escape. So the alcohol then escapes through distillation, gathers in this flask, and what's left in here is all of that flavor, aroma, and pigment. This is like sitting on my grandmother's porch picking beans.
And it's from last year. And that's one of the cooler things is all of these products we're talking about, this is a method of preservation in addition to a method of exploration. So those beans that he showed, the lactic beans, this is the basis of what we're talking about. When lactic bacteria goes to work over the course of a week, 2 weeks, however long the croc's under the sink fermenting, it's unlocking all of these different volatile compounds.
And that's what I was referring to. Like, how do we go in and unlock these doors that have these hidden compounds that we just simply don't have access to?
This one is fun too. So this is actually a leather britches miso. So this one was cooked down leather britches. We cooked them down and took the stock that we cooked it with and utilized it in addition downstairs. But then we took as many pods as we could, well, as the kitchen would let us spare, and fermented it with. We grew the koji spores or aspergillus spores directly on the leather britches, fermented it with salt, so it's just leather britches, and pressed it and let it age for a year. And you get this super rich, super deep, complex flavor. And there's several different flavors that come out of it at the same time. Because it's been aged for so long, certain bacteria have grown on it and created lactic acid, so it's a little sour. It's a little bit sweet. It has this wide spectrum. And this is a process that's been, this is thousands of years old, that's been happening in China and Japan for thousands of years. So being able to take it and apply this process to our ingredients has really helped us change the game. And on top of that, is how many other different traditions are there out there additional to Southern traditions, like the leather britches. The fun story is that moment where you sat down and ate the corn with John and Glenn, it was a similar one to me when you brought in, I believe it was from my test, but the first time you had brought in leather britches in the house Nashville. And that right there was my grandmother. What we did, she would put as much as she could in a jar, because that's how my grandfather preferred them. But anything outside of that or after that, she would dry. And that was just everything. That was my childhood. All of food. But that is how I got this book. Used to raise turkey craw greasy beans. So
we're gonna cook something.
Yeah.
So this is how I learned to make succotash when I was working in Charleston. And anytime I start talking about vibrant ingredients, this is really where my brain kind of goes, using a succotash to present them, because I can time it out to where they're all cooked at different rates, but then all together. So each little ingredient is kind of at its peak. So I just took some butter and I stirred some of that miso. That miso is going to help us think of it as like a dark roux in Creole cooking. It's going to help us start the foundation, the base of this flavor. And so imagine if you were able to make gumbo and use this paste instead of flour. Flour tastes like flour. This tastes like beans. So when you're doing a gumbo, you could do an okra. So this always starts off like this with shallot or onion. and garlic. I prefer shallot. This smells insane. It's so good. It's so good. Wow. Butter, shallots, and leather riches miso. A little bit of garlic. Amazing, amazing, amazing. Next, I put in peppers. What's this varietal?
Those are Jimmy Nardellos, but they're green. So a little underripe, but I think it'll be.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be perfect for this little stew. Still have a good little bit of heat to it.
And I know these beans are gonna take a while to cook, so I added the trinity, if you will, as they call it in Creole cooking. Then I'll add these wonderful greasy beans that we received yesterday that really marks one of my favorite times of year to cook, when the corn, the beans, and the squash are all beautiful. So I'll wait to put the corn in. You'll notice. Okay, at this point, I want to start getting a little bit higher heat and a little bit faster cooking to bring this all together. I'm going to add a little more butter. And which one is this one?
That's just a little bit of cheese.
Is this just a little broth? We use Japanese-style dashi. We make a Japanese-style dashi with leather britches. Just any kind of broth. To speed that cooking up of the beans, because I don't want to overcook them. I want them to be tender, but still taste vibrant and fresh from the field. So I'm using very high heat right now to make that happen as quickly as possible.
The first time that I really thought about volatile compounds was Daniel Boulud in New York. He would talk about when he makes stocks, he would go fast and hard rather than low and slow. And the reason he felt is that when you're smelling these aromas in the air, that's flavor escaping from what you're cooking. I always thought that was fascinating. And then that's what has helped inform the way that we aim for our preservation or our lab exploration.
I spilled some cream in there accidentally. Some people don't like that in the summer, but now I'm gonna add it. I don't even want to saute it. I just want to heat it. I believe that there's this magical moment in an ingredient's life where it's still kind of raw. It's kind of cooked at the same time. And that's what I always chase for in the summer. That's what I always chase in the summertime. You notice we haven't put any salt in.
So a lot of the extraction techniques or a lot of the fermentation techniques, we use salt as like a control point, so it keeps it safe. So if we create this liquid shiokoji or these, soy sauce is salty. So if I'm going to add salt, I'd rather use something that tastes like what I'm cooking. I'd rather season beans with bean-flavored liquid, or I would rather make them bring some acidity by using, some sourness by using some sour beans.
Also, so now I have my salt. This is the brine from pickling the beans. So that's our sour component. That's going to add a little bit of sourness just like you would add acid into a recipe, sourness can do the same thing. I think it's even more interesting for umami and a bit more depth. Also a cleaner flavor. We'll use this liquid shiokoji. And this is a great example of how we like to cook. This is a traditional succotash. I didn't do anything crazy. Where we're able to really shine now because of our perspective on foods and fresh herbs is we're able to push flavor 10 to 20% more than we've ever been able to push it with the things that are in front of us. Why is that important? Because I need people's attention. I need their attention, and I need them to be curious and wonder why it tastes so good. So when someone tells me that's the best succotash they've ever had, I'm not going to say it's because we dumped a bunch of stuff from our lab in there. I'm going to say it's because those greasy beans are pure magic. And then hopefully they'll call Seed Savers Exchange and get the heirloom beans from their region. So I'm going to taste that. We'll see where we're at. And then I'll show you how we would present it and eat it. Maybe not a succotash like this, but any kind of bean or simple dish. Of course, so sweet. Okay, so now this is close. I'll show you a neat way how we eat it. There you go. That's the smell I was looking for. So now, we'll go to the plate. This is something that we're actually working on for this fall and winter, using leaded britches for downstairs. Succotash goes in, and then around it, if you could cut these up in tiny little, I got you right here. Okay. We'll have onion. You do that one. We have some pickled beets, and this is how my family would eat it. You would have some fresh items besides some sour items. Here, some beautiful sun gold tomatoes. Then, beside that fresh item, you would have, oh, that's fresh corn, something sour. And then, beside the white. So now, to me, this is so fun to show because most people don't eat this way. So what you have is a dish that is a collection of amazing ingredients. But if that's all you have for dinner, it can get a little bit boring. And so one way that I noticed my family eating, which I found absolutely fascinating, was you would come up in here for spice and also just an herbal pop. We're going to put some nasturtium. But you would take a bite of bean, and then just like when you're eating sushi and you grab pickled ginger, that same thing can be achieved by eating this raw beet. Then you experience those two things together, and then you grab some corn, and then raw onion usually. You experience those two things together, and then a bite of succotash, and then some sour beans, and you experience those two things together. Bite of succotash, some fresh, something spicy or something bitter. Take another bite of succotash, sour, bite of succotash, fresh, and you end on fresh, if that's what you like. And that's what's fun about it, is everybody has their own pattern to taste things in the sequence that they want to taste them in, and taste things at the end when what they want to taste at the end. And you can see many ways to utilize this green bean oil. And here we'll add this green bean oil, which will give us that garden fresh bean flavor. You can see that. But you can see it has a choose your own adventure experience to it. And that's how I grew up. And to be able to come to work here every day and see how far we can push the food that I grew up with in flavor is something that will keep me busy for the rest of my life and keep me happy for the rest of my life. These are the things that bring me fulfillment as a person, and I hope that this is a small part of my contribution to the cuisine and the culture of the place that I grew up in. It's so rewarding, it's so delicious, and I've had the luxury of watching people's responses and reactions to these flavors in the different restaurants that I've worked in. I've watched people taste Lethbridges for the first time and have their minds blown. I've watched people taste Lethbridges for the first time and really dislike it. And I've watched people cry because they haven't tasted Lethbridges since their grandmother made it for them. And striking a chord of emotion in someone through food, reminding them of where they're from, I think is the ultimate privilege as a chef. And it's certainly one of the reasons that we love Seasonings. That concludes our talk, and we look forward to Q&A.
Wow, thank you so much. We have so many people here wishing they were able to knock on your door right now and taste that. That looks amazing.
Come by.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this story and this demonstration and your inspirations. I know it's inspiring me to try new things already. For those of you watching, if you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll get to as many as we're able to. I'm really struck by this idea of unlocking, I think you said unlocking doors of each ingredient that have hidden flavors that haven't been discovered. And I'm curious how you choose which things might have more flavors. Do you ever get to a point where you think you've found everything a variety has, or is that a never-ending exploration?
The way it has worked out for us is we're very varietal specific, and let's say we have somewhat of a formula, and we have a specific list of pieces of equipment, and we have what we're able to do. And so what we found is if a Mr. Stripy may make the perfect concentrate, but it may make a terrible soy sauce. Mm-hmm. And so we're learning that every varietal, meaning its whole makeup, its DNA, and what is actually available to unlock. And so that's what that even pushes that idea of heirloom varietals even further, because it's proof. The Mr. Stripy ended up making the best concentrate and by a mile. And so it's really case by case. But if I were to flip the camera around, there's a glass behind us that has categories of everything that we're able to do, and inside of it is the ingredients that we've used for those different things. And it's so fun to find out that pinto beans may make a better miso, but black-eyed peas make a better shoyu.
Yeah, wow. And you shared, so it was Mr. Stripy was the tomato that you were talking about. You were talking about the greasy beans. Did you say the variety of those?
This one, I'm not sure the exact variety because we bought a truckload of them. So what I've found in the world of greasy beans and runner beans and those Appalachian style beans is they usually carry the name of a family or a place. I think that's so maybe someday I'll have a bean.
Yeah. And in the chat here, I'm seeing a number of people asking about where to find greasy beans. Do you have suggestions for that?
What's important about our obsession with greasy beans is that it's ours, and it thrives in a particular region, meaning you'll get more product, but also it will taste better because I don't have to explain it to the people in this talk, but it's growing something is a very delicate process, and I've never seen greasy beans outside of Appalachian.
Yeah, bro. Michael might know better over there. He's seen it growing outside of the Appalachian.
We've got Michael over here as a chat moderator. You're getting called in. Have you seen greasy beans grown outside of Appalachia?
I have not.
He says he has not.
And I would like to inspire people to find their greasy bean.
Yeah.
Their place.
Yeah. Mary Alice Reed is asking about your grandmother, Audrey, and did she cook with butter or did she use some other sort of oil for her cooking?
My grandmother, by the time I was cooking with my grandmother, she was in her late 60s, early 70s, and this is late 80s, early 90s. So everyone was terrified of eggs, butter, and olive oil, and she would use like margarine and canola oil, unfortunately, or like what did she call it? Is it canola oil? No. What was the Wesson wood?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. That's margarine made with corn oil.
I think it's a corn oil. Yeah, it was a very interesting time in America. Started as lard for sure, and I never really got to taste a lot of her cooking with lard, but I heard all the stories for sure.
Yeah. And how does your grandmother, or did your grandmother, feel about your cooking and the work that you've been doing? Is she able to experience some of that?
My grandmother passed away in 2009, right as I was opening kind of my ode to Southern ingredients, Husk, and I was able to explain it to her and tell her what an inspiration she was for it, but she never made it to the restaurant. But her signature, I lifted straight from her Social Security card, and it's the logo of the restaurant, and it's on the front door. And every time I walk through that front door, I think about her when I see her name, and I always chuckle a little bit because she has to be up there looking down thinking I'm insane, that I'm completely crazy. But when I'm delivering food to tables, I'll often say, this is chicken and dumplings if my grandma had a lab. Because it is her recipe, the chicken and dumplings. But we push the flavor forward with a fish sauce made with chicken, so that we have a liquid chicken amino sauce. I think she would approve.
I have a question here from Mel Trueblood Stimson saying, do you experience any anti-science rhetoric in Appalachia and have any tips for us Appalachian scientists on combating such without coming off as a bunch of, quote, city folk?
That's amazing. What you're, I think, describing is what I experience every time I go home. And I get a kick out of it. And the way I'm able to narrate that is we all want the most delicious thing possible, and science will help us do that. And once people start to realize that, then they want to taste it.
I bet. You talked a little bit about kind of competition between people trying to grow the best things and cook the best things. And I'm curious how much of your work you feel is proprietary. You also talked about wanting to, share the idea of Southern cuisine and push boundaries. How do you kind of deal with that question of proprietary versus community sharing?
That's an interesting question that I was actually thinking about this morning when I was making some notes on why seed saving was important to me. And think that's one of the fun parts about it is, when my grandmother's bean that she grew year after year, it's like a turkey crawl kind of bean, like a wild goose kind of bean. That's hers. It doesn't belong to anybody else. It's hers. It has her name on it. It has her name attached to it. And I think there's a lot of romance to that. But as far as ideas and sharing, we want Southern food to be as delicious as possible. So we look at this as a communal thing. We want to teach these concentrates. Everyone that walks through here, I teach them how to make it because I know it will help their cooking instantly. And for me, I'm very, very lucky. I get to travel the world and bring these ingredients to these corners where people have never experienced them before and probably have the wrong impression of what Southern cooking is and probably no idea what Appalachian cooking is. Last week, week before last, I was just in New York City cooking at an extraordinary restaurant there, and we brought all Appalachian ingredients and told all of the stories. And having been stuck because of COVID for the last 2 to 3 years, it was a great reminder that our cuisine is unique and extraordinary, and it's ours.
Let's see. So I have a question here. What would you consider an easy recipe that folks can get started with some of those new flavors, like sour or salty, from the ingredients that they're maybe already used to cooking with instead of just adding salt or acid?
Start adding salt to the ingredients and souring your own vegetables.
It's really funny. If you walk down to my car right now and you open the trunk, there's a box of seasoning, and it's little squirt bottles with labels on them so that no matter where I am, I can make the food as delicious as possible. It's like my survival kit. And I have one at home. I have a drawer that you pull out, and it's just squirt bottles full of all these different acidic, sour, salty components and umami components. And I believe that it's going to become more and more common over the next 10 years of people no matter where you are, you'll be able to go to the store and find some of these things. It's already starting to happen. We're already talking to grocery stores about getting these things on the shelf. But for the most part, the fermentation is very simple. It's 2% for 2 weeks.
So you mix your vegetables you weigh your vegetables, multiply that weight by 2%. That's how much salt you add. Mix them together, press them. Crock typically is the best. Ceramic crock is the best with a little press. And you just let them age for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however long until they get to your flavor you like. Most of the time they'll get, we were talking about food waste earlier. This was something that was sour corn was passed down from the German immigrants who came to the Appalachian region. And they longed for that sauerkraut flavor, but they didn't really have a lot of fresh cabbage. But the Native Americans would share their corn with them. They would treat it the exact same way as they would sauerkraut, and now we have sour corn.
That's great. How has the work you're doing influenced some of the farmers that you're working with? Are they growing any new and different varieties because of your collaborations?
A big part of my focus over the years is collaborations with farmers, especially after I realized I was terrible at farming and should stick to cooking. But I will say, if we're looking at the overall influence I think we've had on the farmers of this region, it's certainly about varietals, but it's been more about handling of the product from the farm to the restaurant and how that product is handled in the field And when it's picked, we're very particular about when something leaves the farm in its stage of maturity. And that's for us, it's enormous difference. And it's been so fun having farmers here that are willing, because it's extra work, it's extra thinking, it's extra planning, it's extra strategy, it's extra risk. So we're very, very thankful when they are able to work alongside us.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of one of the comments you made early in your presentation about learning. I think you were talking about how Glenn was talking about the temperature in the mills and how that makes such a big difference, and just every little step along the way contributing to the final product. Let's see, I have another question here. What are some other varieties of crops that influence your cuisine? So kind of going in that other direction, varieties influencing what you're doing.
Here in this region, corn, beans, and squash, that's really the foundation of a lot of things. So I tend to focus a lot on corns and beans over the last 15, 20 years. But now my interests are mostly in varietals of Native American squash and the complexities that are in those varietals. Candy roaster squash has kind of stolen the show for me. To give you an example of how we work. So when squash starts to show up out of the field, especially the first year we had this research and development lab, we put them all through the paces, and just like I was saying with the tomatoes, each one tends to be suited for different techniques and different applications. But overall, nothing can touch the candy roaster squash. Nothing. It is one of the most extraordinary varietals, period. Oh, this is, we need some now. We don't have any.
We got reserved squash. So that's, yeah, we've got a bunch of candy roasters preserved in various ways. But what I think with the candy roaster is, you know, when we think about those types of fall squash, it is more sweet. The sugars are less complex. So it lended itself well to being able to concentrate or extract without a lot of manipulation. You know, if it's a bean, it has a complex fiber structure, or complex starch structure that requires more effort, more work to break that apart or work around it. And so with the candy roaster squash, it's you eat it, you can eat it raw. You eat it raw and it's delicious. It's super sweet on its own. That's the name, candy roaster. And it only gets more sweet as you concentrate or roast it. So yeah.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this. Do you have any final advice or comments for us as we start thinking about exploring more flavors from the things that we're growing?
What I did very early on was, in order to find the ingredients in the region I was cooking in, I connected with universities and professors, one in particular, David Shields. He changed everything for me. I would not be thinking the way I'm thinking if I'd never met Professor David Shields. And that brings me to the advice of look outside of your world. There are other people just as obsessive and passionate about these things, and we need all the help we can get.
I like that. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining in and sending in great questions. Chef Sean and Sam, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having us.
Thanks, y'all.